Hi everyone, welcome to our second online lecture for the Politics of U.S. Public Policy. In the last lecture we started talking about market failures and how government might remedy them, and today we're going to be turning to the political side of the story. Now, the main point that I left you with last time was that market failure can be remedied in many cases by effective government policies, but whether you get effective government policies isn't really a question of economics, it's a question of politics. So today we're really going to think about the politics. After all, the powerful actors that are active in the economy are also active in our politics, right? And there's no reason to think that they won't try to influence politics in ways that undermine the capacity to address market failures. Okay, so today's lecture is going to have 5 basic parts. First, we're going to talk about a very important argument by Ronald Coase that raises the question of whether or not you can deal with externalities and other kinds of market failures without government, through private bargaining. And that argument is often taken to imply, wrongly, I think, that you don't need to have government coercion or government action to deal with certain kinds of market failures. Then we're going to actually turn to politics. And politics is the realm of collective action. Remember from that article you read on path dependence that in politics, unlike markets, collective action and the use of public authority are central. And when you're talking about collective action, then you get real biases that are a result of the differential capacity of different segments of society to organize to influence government. And in particular, we're going to think about a form of influence that's often called rent-seeking. I'll unpack that in a moment, but you can take the basic argument to be that in some areas of policy, there's a lot of rent-seeking, a lot of activity that's designed to deliver outsized benefits to narrow private interests, and thus the rent is too damn high. George Stigler's argument that you read actually leads us to think that basically all of government policy is a result of rent-seeking. And I don't think that's true, and we'll think about why it's not. And then I'll turn to the question of how our view of government regulation and the rent-seeking activities of private business are changed when we consider that capital, that is financial capital and companies, are mobile, not just across city and state boundaries, but also across countries. I'm really interested in exploring this question of how, if markets are subject to failure, government might remedy those failures, given that government is subject to its own biases. And in particular, if you think about it, the corporate actors whom you might want to regulate to deal with market failure are also really powerful players in our politics. We're going to be thinking a lot about environmental policy, and energy producers and other actors, corporate actors that pollute the environment, are also big contributors to political campaigns. They're very important given their employment in certain swing states. And when we think about the interaction of economics and politics, we also have to think about the ways in which government can be subject to influence and even perhaps capture by powerful private economic interests. And that's particularly fraught in a world in which capital can move easily, not just from one city to another or one state to another, but from one country to another, right? Corporations are truly global at this point. And so how do we think about regulation and addressing market failures in a global economic context? So I get the sense that some of you are worried about the question of how much economics you really need to know to grasp the core concept of market failure and the ways, and to think about the ways in which government might address it. And the short answer is you really don't have to know a lot. I realize that the text that we're reading, the economy, includes a lot of very complicated concepts, but the basic argument is actually pretty simple, and the basic concepts are pretty simple. And I'm going to work very hard to try to distill the essence of these concepts down so that you can understand them without a lot of grounding, or any grounding actually, in economics. That said, if you decide that you're really inspired to do more economics research or study, I'd love that. And I just want to emphasize that you guys should be asking questions about this when you don't understand, because if you're confused, I am sure a lot of other people are confused as well. Maybe I'm confused, so those questions can help clarify my own thinking too. So this genial-looking man is Ronald Coase. He passed away not too long ago at a ripe age, over 100 years old, in 2013. He won the Nobel Prize in Economics for the work that I'm going to be talking about. Now, Coase came at this from the law, and he noticed that in the law there was a lot of focus on liability, on the harms that were imposed on some actor. Here he talks about actor A inflicting harm on B. And you can think about this actor A as, say, a factory that's polluting the water, and actor B as being the people who have to deal with the pollution. And the point that Coase was making was, if we stopped A from polluting the water, that actually would be restricting A's freedom to do something that they wanted to do, and thus imposing a harm on actor A. There was always a reciprocal relationship. So what Coase argued was basically that if there weren't any cost for bargaining, for negotiating contracts, for monitoring or enforcing compliance with those contracts, and so on, if there weren't any what he called transaction costs, it didn't really matter whether you allocated property rights to one actor or another. And let me explain that a little bit more. So let's say you have a classic case of pollution where a factory is polluting the water for a town. Now, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that the factory actually owns the waterway, and so the town is going to have to figure out how to get the factory to see it as in their interest to not pollute their water. So if the factory owns the waterway, then the town basically needs to figure out what's the price that they can offer to the factory so that it doesn't pollute their water, and they would bargain in this Coase-inspired scenario to an outcome that would produce, according to Coase, the most efficient outcome. Now, if on the other hand the property rights for the waterway are in the citizens' hands, then they can stop the factory from polluting, and the factory would have to pay the town for permission to pollute the water up to a level that the town believed it was willing to tolerate, and at that price. Here's where the problem arises. A lot of people take Coase to be saying that all forms of market failure, basically, particularly those dealing with externalities, right? When one party is exposing a cost on the other party, and those costs aren't being taken into account in the market, that whenever you have that kind of market failure, you can just bargain your way to a efficient, socially optimal solution. And here you have a quote from the Conservative Heritage Foundation making this argument back in 2010, when there was this active debate over climate change policies that were being proposed by President Obama and congressional Democrats. So basically this argument is, you just have to define the property rights. You tell it's either the factory or the citizen who owns the water, and the question is basically, what's the right payment from one to the other that's going to allow the optimal level of economic activity that pollutes to occur. But I want to point out that the Coase theorem is really a misstatement of what Coase said in his seminal article. It's, first of all, really important to understand that Coase is interested in the overall economic effect. Right? He's interested in whether or not you get an efficient outcome, which he defines as basically that you do the level of production that would produce the largest social good overall. But he's not saying anything about the distribution of that benefit. And indeed, in the story that I just told, right, it makes a huge difference if the factory or the citizens own the water, because if the factory owns the water, then the citizens have to pay it off, which isn't going to feel very fair given that they're drinking poisoned water. The second thing to say is that that this assumes that there aren't any costs of bargaining. And maybe that makes sense in cases where you have very narrow forms of harm that are affecting just a few parties. But in most cases, the transaction costs are really huge. You have to figure out what the harm is. You have to bargain to a better outcome. You have to have a system for creating a contract that governs that bargain. And then you have to be able to monitor and enforce it. Those are big costs. And I have a quote here from someone who says that the Coase Theorem is kind of silly because the transaction costs are never zero. This quote, I think, is very powerful because the author of this quote is Ronald Coase himself. So an important point here, right, is that the allocation of property rights has huge distributional consequences, even when there's an ability to bargain. And that means that the allocation of property rights is really a huge influence on what we've called in earlier classes power, right? Who has the power to get the outcome that they want and on what terms, right? And the second important point is that in many of the cases where government is involved, transaction costs are very high, right? It's almost impossible to think about how you could come up with a bargaining solution to large-scale air pollution or water pollution where millions of people are potentially involved. Okay, now we're moving from economics to politics. And as we move from economics to politics, as that piece by Paul Pearson on path dependence argued, we move into the realm of collective action. So politics is a realm in which collective action is omnipresent, right? Groups form together to try to influence government. Government itself is a form of collective action. And in any form of collective action, there's always this risk of what's called free riding. Free riding is when you will receive a benefit from people acting together, even if you don't join into that collective action, and therefore you don't join in. And of course, at the extreme, it means that you don't have collective action at all, that everybody essentially rationally decides that they're going to free ride, and groups that are seeking these broad benefits don't form at all. Now, there's a number of implications of this that we'll talk about, but I want to point out that when Mancur-Olsen first introduced this idea in the 1960s, he pointed out that there were at least 3 cases in which you would get collective action if even despite the fact that people might rationally want a free ride. So one possibility is what Mancur-Olsen called privileged actors. That's when there are actors who get so much benefit from collective action that they're willing to shoulder all the cost of collective action, even if everyone else free rides. Now, of course, that's not likely to be the case in many instances. Now, Olsen also argued in his later work that over time, small groups could kind of figure out how to overcome collective action problems, right? So there's communication among them, they learn from each other, there are norms that enforce on them an expectation that they will contribute to this common good. And that's similar to the argument that I alluded to earlier about how private actors might be able to deal with common pool resource problems, at least on a small scale. Olsen clearly recognized there was another way to deal with collective action problems, namely to force people to contribute, right? So he pointed out, for example, that labor unions are based on this form of coercion, right? A huge issue in labor policy right now is whether or not unions can require dues of people who benefit from their activities. So even if you're not a member of the union, you might benefit from collective bargaining. But if everyone says, well, I want to get the benefit of the union, but I don't want to contribute to the union, then of course the union falls apart. So that's why the requirement that you be a member of a union to receive the benefits of the union has been so important to the formation and maintenance of unions in all countries. Lastly, Olsen talks about what he calls selective incentives. And the crucial thing here is that a selective incentive is a benefit that you receive for being part of the group. It's not the public good, the broad benefit that you get through your collective action. Rather, it's something that comes from being part of the effort. So what might be an example of a selective incentive? Well, the AARP, which is a group representing older Americans, actually provides low-cost insurance to its members. And lots of people sign up for the AARP just because they want to get the insurance benefits. But as a result of signing up to get those insurance benefits, they also are contributing to a group that advocates on behalf of a very large and diffuse group of Americans, namely the elderly. So if you take Olsens' argument literally, it has some pretty stark implications. It suggests that it's really small groups with very narrow concentrated interests that are going to be most likely to organize, right? Whereas broad groups, consumers, workers as a whole, big swaths of society, say everyone concerned about the environment, are going to have a lot of harder time organizing. Because those narrow groups, they can overcome these collective action problems. And so the implication really is that the interest groups that we see in society are all going to be representing pretty narrow, concentrated interests. They're going to be what commentators sometimes call special interests. And remember, in our discussion of power, that groups that are organized often have the ability to get what they want over groups that aren't organized. That is, they have power. And so this collective action problem, which might seem just like an economic problem, is actually a deep source of power imbalances in our society. And it suggests that these sort of narrow groups are going to dominate politics. So does the political world look this way? Well, over the course of our time together, I've talked about the powerful role that interest groups play, but I've also talked about the ways in which broad majorities of citizens can have influence, and talked about groups like environmental organizations or broad groups representing labor or consumers. But it is the case that there is a lot of organized activity in American politics that is basically devoted to rent seeking. This is Jimmy McMillan. He was a brief and humorous feature of the 2012 presidential election, running as the standard bearer of the Rent is Too Damn High party. Now, Jimmy McMillan was actually talking about the rent because he was a candidate based out of New York City, where housing costs have been skyrocketing. But when economists speak about rents, they mean something else. So when they talk about a rent, they mean an above market return to an economic actor. You could think of this as an abnormal profit or a really high price relative to what you would expect in a well-functioning market. And in fact, today, in the discourse around government policy, rents are usually discussed as above market returns that are a result of favorable public policy. Rent seeking, in turn, is when individual economic actors or groups pursue such policies to receive those rents. So one important thing to emphasize is that rents are tied up with public policy, but they're not always the result of government acting. Remember, we learned that government inaction is often as important as government action. And when a rent is due to the fact that there's a distortion in the market, government not regulating that distortion can create these abnormal returns. So consider the example of climate change, right? The rent here is that corporations that produce energy don't have to pay for the damage to the climate that is caused by their activities, right? So that's an above market return, but it's above market return that's due to the fact that government isn't trying hard enough to prevent carbon emissions, right? Whether it's through a tax on carbon or through some kind of overall limit on carbon emissions, perhaps with tradable carbon permits. Now, I just want to note down here at the bottom, it says that the term is used a little differently in the online text, The Economy. And all you need to know is that when I'm talking about rent seeking, and indeed when most people are talking about rent seeking, they're really talking about this idea of above market returns that are a result of government policy. So here's an example that many of you talked about, the so-called war on coal. This, of course, was a battle cry that was used against President Obama when he put regulations on coal-fired power plants. And the argument was basically that President Obama was trying to destroy the coal industry, and this was a war not just on coal, but on coal workers. And this cry was very effectively used by Donald Trump in the 2016 presidential campaign to win over regions that were heavily dependent on coal. Now, as Paul Pearson and I point out in American Amnesia, if there's a war, that's taking place around coal, it's been a war on us by the coal industry. Why? Because coal is one of the dirtiest forms of power. And this calculation from Bill Nordhaus and colleagues shows that the price of coal is actually well below the price that it should be if you take into account the external costs, right? Not only air pollution, not only climate change, but also really concentrated negative effects on those who live in coal-dependent regions. So this is a really good illustration of the point about externalities, right? The coal price actually doesn't include a lot of the external costs. Now, you might think that if those external costs were taken into account, there would be no coal production at all. And it's true that coal has lost ground relative to natural gas because we're right now in this era of very cheap gas. But the argument isn't that you shouldn't produce coal. It's that if you had the external costs of coal factored into the price, there would be both much less production of it and, more important, production of it that resulted in fewer externalities, because that cost would be taken into account by both producers and consumers. So this argument that because of the collective action problem, government ended up being essentially a gravy train for narrow private economic interest is sometimes called the Chicago School. And that's because a set of University of Chicago economists were the ones who put forth the basic propositions that lay behind this view. And perhaps the most prominent of them was this man, George Stigler, who wrote one of the most famous essays on regulation ever written. And it's not just one of the most famous articles ever written on regulation. It's also, in my view, probably one of the most wrong-headed arguments ever written about government. Now, Stigler had a kernel of truth, and as you read the article, keep in mind he was writing more than 50 years ago when there were, in fact, a lot of regulations that looked like the kind of barriers to entry regulation that he's most interested in. So Stigler's argument was basically that regulation was a protection racket, right? It was a way in which corporations protected themselves against competition. You know, the classic examples would be airlines and trucking in the old world, in which there was regulations that prevented competitors from forming. And today, I think probably the best example of this form of economic regulation, this sort of barriers to entry regulation, is probably occupational licensing. You know, even as labor unions have declined dramatically, a strikingly large share of the workforce requires a license now. This is everything from people working in hair salons to sophisticated medical professionals. And I think there's an argument to be made that these limits on who can do certain jobs based on pretty strict criteria are not always justified and raise the incomes of those within the favored and licensed professions and reduce the ability of others to enter those professions and thus the incomes of those outside them. But Stigler's argument is far too broad. For one thing, right after Stigler wrote, there was a huge wave of deregulation in airlines and trucking and a host of other areas. And indeed, a lot of regulations just don't look like the barriers to entry that Stigler was writing about. For example, we have extremely extensive environmental regulation in the United States. As we'll see next week, our leadership in environmental regulation has declined, but we were the world's leader in putting in place environmental rules that limited the next negative externalities of environmental pollution. The other thing to say is that Stigler was really focused on when government stepped in to protect regulated industries. But as I said before, one way in which government policy can give narrow private interests above market returns, that is, provide rents, is to not regulate those industries enough. And remember, we talked in the last lecture about the problem of systemic financial risk, right? The huge externality that the financial sector can impose on the rest of the economy, because while those in finance can prosper by driving up systemic risk, but ultimately the entire society might bear the cost if the financial sector crashes. Remember that quote from Chuck Prinz where he said, if the music is playing, you have to keep dancing, right? Well, while those financiers were dancing, they were making a lot of money. When the market crashed, though, government had to step in to basically bail out the financial industry. So Stigler's argument is that important areas of regulation are captured, and he illustrates that argument through forms of government policy that basically restrict the market. But in fact, there's another form of capture. That's when government doesn't regulate the market enough. That might be called corrosive capture. That's the term that David Moss and Daniel Carpenter use in an important article on this phenomenon. Finally, I just want to emphasize that these issues are even more complex when you start to think about the ways in which corporations and other economic actors can move across borders, between cities, across state borders, and even in the global economic context, across national borders, right? So many of the kinds of failures we're talking about, climate change, one that's very topical to us today, that is a global pandemic, spill across borders, across state borders, across city lines, and across national boundaries. And this makes things extremely hard for two reasons. One is the one that I think you all know about, right? We don't have a global government. We have to figure out ways to cooperate in the international realm without that central locus of coercion, government, that we have in the national realm. But there's another issue that arises when corporations and other economic actors can move across boundaries. And that's that corporations can escape, in some cases, from regulations or taxes by moving from one jurisdiction to another. Think of the huge competition that we talked about at the start of the class over the new Amazon headquarters. Or think about the threats that corporations routinely make to labor unions and to government that they'll go abroad if national policies are too strict. And of course, corporations locate a lot of their operations in places that have very low tax rates or limited regulations, precisely because they're trying to avoid efforts to deal with some of the market failures that we're talking about. So now we're moving into the policy and action portion of this module. So we've talked about social dilemmas and market failures, and we've thought about the ways in which politics, and particularly the power of private economic actors, can condition the ways in which government might respond to market failures. And I put a heavy emphasis on the idea that in areas that involve really high economic stakes, the differential ability of different parts of society to act collectively matters a lot. And even though we don't want to overstate the extent to which narrow private interests have an advantage in our politics, they clearly do have disproportionate influence. But now we're going to look at how that plays out in American energy and environmental policy. We'll start on Monday with an application of some of these concepts to the basic features of U.S. energy and environmental policy. And then on Wednesday, we're going to turn to the mother of all market failures, namely the huge effects on our planet of carbon emissions and the question of how we're going to actually deal with this existential challenge given the political and economic realities we've discussed. I'll look forward to continuing the conversation with you next week.